Hey everybody, welcome back to Planet Coaster, and welcome back to Aerobats of Arabia. Today I'm going to work on the Mamluk Mainstreet, but this name doesn't really represent what I'm building because it's more of a riverfront area as well, just like the last episode, except this one is going to be Egyptian themed. Now I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail later, because first I'm trying something completely different, and it's something that I've never tried in Planet Coaster before, and it's Moroccan architecture. And I discovered that there's plenty of pieces in the game and the Theme Maker's Toolkit items to figure out how to make the details and shapes and colors and textures of this kind of architecture in this game. And I'm kind of obsessed with it recently because it's just really cool and something so different from what I've done before. And that's what this series is all about, by the way, to be very honest. I've gotten a lot of comments about me always building Japanese and Alpine and maybe some steampunk parks here and there, and it's getting repetitive. Well, no more. I want to try and branch out to as many different architectural styles as I can with this series, and I'm also just realizing how much fun it is. That said, hours and hours of research actually goes into this, which sounds like I'm taking this game way too seriously, but to be very honest, it's also just really enjoyable. I find there's a lot of fun in searching up new types of architecture, new sites and cities, and figuring out how they work. And I think one of the best ways to learn about things is to try and do it yourself. So in this case, it's just a really cool way to figure out how the intricacies of certain architectures and cities work. And it's all part of the journey, I'd say. Now, that said, about Moroccan architecture, there are various styles of Moroccan architecture. You have kind of more of the inland Berber kind of architecture, or the Almohad kind of architecture that you find along the seaside. There are cities with completely different city centers in terms of the colors and textures used, but in this case, I am just going to try and blend them together at some point in the future. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to figure everything out when I get to more Moroccan architecture, because there's certainly going to be a lot more of it in this area. But for now, I'm just focusing on this one building, and this one's quite representative because it's more or less following the basic model of all mosques, or at least minarets, in Morocco. Now, a typical Moroccan minaret will consist of a square tower, and on top of which is placed a kind of cylindrical tower with some finials or a spire on top of it. And that's really it. It's a very basic shape, and no matter what kind of major city in Morocco you look up, you'll find many of those kinds of minarets. So that's probably the best way to represent Morocco and make it very recognizable instantly. And I think getting to the core of whatever architectural symbolism is typical for whichever country is going to be very important for this whole area, because I'm mixing up so many different countries. We have the Persian wind towers, and in the near future we have some Egyptian areas, and then we also have Morocco. And to the average person who doesn't spend hours on Wikipedia like I like to do, I think it's going to be very difficult to tell those apart. So I will definitely have to use some tricks to make them a bit more memorable and recognizable. And that all starts out with this building. Now, what I'm working on here is I started off with the archways, which I wanted to cross the path with, because this is just something that I was planning for a while. I wanted some kind of gallery over there crossing the path. And then over here, I'm working on the tower of the minarets. Well, it's the tower itself, but the lower square tower part of it. And something fun to say about this one is that it uses a very particular decoration pattern, which is also called a sepka, I've recently learned, which also just means net, which refers to, well, you can probably tell it kind of looks like a net texture down there. And it's a very common interlacing motif that you find in Moroccan architecture. And I figured it was doable to do this thing with some very thin supports. I believe those support beams are made by Hydro. Not entirely sure. By the way, on Twitter I posted a link to my Steam collection, where I save all of my Theme Maker's Toolkit items. I've been getting many questions about which items I use and how to keep up to date with them. So just go over to my Twitter, it's twitter.com/silverrat, and you can find the link over there. everything I use in this series is included in that, as well as some other tidbits I use in some other videos. Plus, I think they're all very good items to use. I try to only stick to those Theme Maker's Toolkit items that are actually useful, because I know how easy it is to fall into that trap of getting too many items all at once. So, yeah, I'd recommend following the collection, or at least checking it out for yourself and see if there's anything interesting in there. I find that because the Theme Maker's Toolkit is not used that much, and because Planet Coaster is not that popular of a game anymore, many of these items end up being kind of underrated. So I'm trying to bring some appreciation to how much they managed to change the game. And I think this type of architecture is one example of that. This building would have never been possible without Theme Maker's Toolkit. Be it the sepka patterns that I made with the pillars. Then on the top section of the square part here, I used some wallpaper and decoration items from Theme Maker's Toolkit that I think make a huge difference as well. And then for the decorations on the roofline there, the little battlement-like decorations, I also used some small bricks from the Theme Maker's Toolkit, so none of these things would have been possible with the Theme Maker's Toolkit. I also find some people arguing that sticking with vanilla items is more creative in a sense, because you have to sort of use very creative ways to figure out how to make things with certain pieces. You know, you have to figure out how to make what you want with a very limited amount of pieces. But honestly, I tend to disagree with that, because as you can see, you can use Theme Maker's Toolkit items in completely different ways from what they're supposed to as well, and make some things that you wouldn't be able to make without them. So while I think there's certainly a difference between just dragging Theme Maker's Toolkit items into the game and not really adding or changing much about it, which, by the way, is also fine, because whatever way you want to play the game is fine, of course. It's just the way that you enjoy it, and everybody should be able to enjoy it the way they like. But, you know, I think there's a lot of creativity involved, even if you're using custom pieces, if not more so creativity. That's a horrible sentence, but you know what I mean, because there are so many more mixes and matches that you can do, and yeah, with every new piece you add, the amount of possibilities just exponentially increases. That all said, I probably should talk a bit about what I've been building here. So I finished the top part of the minaret as well, and with that, it really has achieved that kind of, yeah, typical architecture for the area, I think. And now it's time to finish the gallery that's crossing the pathway over here. Another fun thing that I think is worth pointing out, the arches that I placed below there are also referred to as Polyloped Arches, because they have all of those little decorations. Now, to be fair, these aren't quite as decorated as they can be in real life, where they can have very detailed carvings everywhere. But the point is, you see all of those different lobes, and it's a style that would typically be used for more decorative buildings, so mosques and palaces and that kind of thing. So I think for this building, it's very fitting, and it's a fun way to also come up with, you know, a different type of arch every time I want to build arches somewhere. There's just something so cool about making those themed elements like arches and domes and spires, and figuring out how you can do it, each one a little bit differently every time you get to build one. Now that is more or less it for the mosque building here, but one thing that I should probably say is that I wanted to connect this building somehow to this facade on the other side, to the shop building that I built in the last episode. Because that was the whole plan for this area. I wanted the shop building to extend and cross the path into the facade on the other side, so that we have lots of buildings and we can really make this feel like you're walking through a city. The only problem I had with this is that once I built it, I realized that it didn't really work out in the composition that I was going for. Now the composition was kind of simple, to have two tower-like elements on both sides of the arches crossing the pathway, and then yeah, you have the arches in the middle and one tower on one side, and now that's the wind catcher from the shop, and another tower-like building on the other side. But after building this minaret, I realized it's too tall and too detailed compared to this wind catcher over here, and I think it's just attracting all of the attention to itself, which is not really working out from a compositional standpoint. And yes, I am going to talk about composition again, because after the last episode, I'm still not done. So eventually, I decided not to scrap this building, but I moved it to a different location, and I wanted to figure out a different way to get to what I wanted to do and make it fit into the area a little bit better. And I think this all works out fine actually in the end, because I moved the minarets to a different location where I wanted to build Moroccan architecture more anyway, so I think that works out. But it just means that, you know, sometimes the buildings have to be moved to a different location. Now, and Seven can probably say a lot about this, but I think it's never a bad thing to look at what you've built and see if things actually work out, because sometimes you can have the most beautiful buildings, but they just don't really work out next to each other. And that's something that ended up happening here. So, for the better of the composition of this whole area, I decided to work on this building again and give it a more Egyptian touch, and instantly move to the Egyptian style that I wanted to do for this row of buildings. Now this means that this building is a little bit lower and a little bit smaller and a little bit less detailed than the minaret tower. But the overall picture it creates, and especially looking from the bridge, which is still a very important viewpoint, I think it just works out a little bit better. Now, also something that I think is worth pointing out, whenever theme parks do Egyptian themed areas, we typically get to see pyramids and ancient Egyptian themes. And while I think that's very interesting, in this whole series, I kind of want to focus more on architecture from the last few centuries, especially architecture from the late 19th century, which I think, you know, capturing late 19th century from everywhere is really cool, because you get to incorporate lots of revival architecture elements, and it's just before modern architecture came up and started replacing most of the old styles. There are lots of discussions to be had about that, and while I don't think modern architecture is bad per se, I'm just a huge fan of 19th century architecture, and especially for theme parks and trying to transport people into a kind of make-believe better than the real world. I think it's basically my favorite. Now this specifically is a whole row of buildings that's going to be inspired by Mamluk architecture, which is from the Mamluk Sultanate between the 13th and the 16th century in Egypt. So not quite ancient Egyptian, but still very Egyptian, I would say. And it's a style that continues to have a huge influence in historic Cairo, where you can still find many buildings that are reminiscent of that style or simply from that era. It's also, from my brief look into the history of Egypt, the most prosperous era of Egypt in recent decades, or centuries I should say. So just a really fun style, and I think it also manages to have a very good connection to the architecture that's already in this area, the Middle Eastern and Persian architecture, because it just manages to transition very seamlessly into that. And then on the other side we can transition into Moroccan architecture, and it all should work out pretty well. Now the reason this works well with the buildings that are already in this area is because we get to use similar colors and similar shapes of buildings, but the detailing is definitely very different. And I think one of the best ways to tell this already is by the use of the different layers of stone and different colors of stone. As you can tell, I'm not actually using wall pieces. Well, I am using some wall pieces, but I am using some of the detail pieces to create different layers of bricks in different colors. And when looking at pictures from Cairo and similar cities built in this style, you can find this a lot. Different layers of sandstone and sometimes even different types of materials, which provide a really interesting texture to walls. And the same goes for arches and any decorative elements. They'll have some lighter and some darker stones as well. So that's something that I'm going to play around with a lot in this area. And another thing that changes, but is kind of a little bit similar, is the use of wood, and especially oriel windows. I found that there is a huge amount of wooden carvings and things like that all over the buildings of this style in Cairo, and especially on the oriel windows which you see everywhere. So the Oriole windows are coming back from the areas that I've already built in this park, because I've built quite a few of them. But in this part we'll have some more, and we'll have some other wooden decorations on top of that as well. One of them is this roof ridge over here, which I find is very common on many buildings in Cairo, especially some of the drinking fountain buildings. Something that you find in a lot of Ottoman architecture, but just in general in the Middle Eastern area, is public water fountains with their own designated buildings. And I think it makes a lot of sense, because they have a very important public function, especially in that part of the world where the climate isn't so forgiving. But they're typically very decorated buildings, and they really stand out in their area. They have a lower section where some doors can open up to water fountain or dispenser or whatever. And then some higher sections with lots of details, and sometimes also some wooden carvings and roof ridges, just like the one that I've built just here. So reminiscent of that style is how I ended up building this building. And then the next few buildings in this row are going to be similar, but slightly different to the buildings that I've built so far in this whole area. So a bit more wood, a bit more different brick colors, a bit darker all in general. But it also manages to fit with the overall area. And this is something that I was trying to go for as much as possible. So when you're standing on the bridge, for instance, and you can see the whole area, you can see that the colors of the materials, the shapes of buildings, and the items used, they all kind of fit together, but you can kind of see a transition happening from one side to the other. And the way that I imagine this at some point in the future is that if you stand on the bridge and you look towards the lift hills of the coasters, on the left you can see some Ottoman architecture, and then it shifts to kind of modern day Middle Eastern architecture, some Persian influences, and then you go down to Egypt with still very similar colors and building types, but you can slightly see it shifting. And then when you move your view all the way to the right, you can see the beginning of the Moroccan area, which is once again similar but different. And hopefully that's going to end up working out, and everything will look similar enough to look like one giant themed area from a distance. But once you get really into ground level and into some specific streets and plazas of different areas, you can tell the difference, and you can tell that you're in a slightly different area. At least that's the goal that I'm going for with this this whole park. And I think it's also a way that I just have to approach this, because I want to try out so many different architecture styles. I think most theme parks in real life would have just called this whole area a generic Arabian architecture area, and just mixed and mashed all kinds of Arabian themes in a kind of Orientalist way. But in this series, I'm trying not to be about that. That said, obviously, I'm still looking at all of this from a Western perspective, and this is still a theme park, so everything is still quite fantasy, and I'm not an expert on any of these styles of architecture, and I think that probably deserves to be called out, because it definitely means that they're not going to be super realistic or accurate, and it's always my own interpretation of what these things are like. That said, I'm trying to be more realistic than theme parks, because in theme parks in the real world, you typically see that these things are very botched in a sense, and if you look into certain types of styles of architecture, you typically find that in theme parks they're a little bit different, and you can always see that they're not entirely accurate. Although there are some exceptions, I think. I think the World Showcase in Disney is a really good example, and also a good inspiration, I think, whenever you're trying to do Planko builds with different styles of different countries. And Phantasialand sometimes does it very well too. I think the Chinese area in Phantasialand is amazing. So those are some examples that come to mind, but most of them, even Disney Sea's Arabian Coast, which was part of the inspiration for this park, is a little bit of a mishmash of all kinds of different things. It's a bit hard to pin down exactly what it's trying to be, and it's definitely a fantasy kind of Arabian architecture, not entirely realistic. That said, that's also not a critique of it in any way. That's just how it is, because it is beautiful, and I love Disney Sea. and it's still a huge influence on this park, and part of what makes this park fun to work on. And I should be very careful, I'm already naming this a park, but you know, that all has to do with whether my computer can manage it. And I got some questions about that in the last episode. My computer should be more than good enough to handle just about anything in this game, because I got a new computer recently and it's pretty good. But, you know, Planet Coaster doesn't have the very best performance once you start adding all of these elements. And I also shouldn't critique the game too much over that, because I'm doing things with this game that you're really not supposed to, and adding so many Theme Maker's Toolkit items. And, you know, when you're building domes out of thousands of pieces, really, who should you blame when your game starts lagging? It's probably myself, but, you know, I want to not have to skip out on any details, but I also want to see if I can turn this into a full park. So, you know, that's the dilemma. Anyway, we're moving into the last part of this video. And I say that because this is the last row of facades, and once again I'm trying out some new way to make a nice horseshoe arch. Although this isn't really a horseshoe arch, this is just a pointy one. I think I haven't really gotten around to the discussion of different types of arches yet, but we'll do that in the future. For now, it's good to know that a horseshoe arch is basically, as the name says, it's those kind of Arabian arches, or at least the type of arch that many people associate with Arabian architecture, where it curves a little bit inwards before it moves down to the pillars that support the arch. And it's very common in all kinds of Arabian architecture, but the same goes for this pointy style of building arches, and then also the polylobed arch as well. So with those different arch types that aren't regular round arches and mixing them up a little bit, you can very quickly start creating an Arabian vibe to an area. Now this is going to house a small restaurant, actually. I haven't talked about the actual function of these buildings yet, but yes, I am going to do more interiors, and no, I'm not sure how well this is going to go, but I really want to make sure that all of my buildings in this park actually have a function, and I'm not just building the exteriors, which has always been a huge trap of mine. I ended up always building kind of useless buildings. I think in Jägerhorn I put some stalls in there, but nothing much in terms of interiors. And yeah, that's about it. There are some interiors in Volvara. Surely there are some small interiors in Koali Beach, but most of my builds haven't really had interiors yet. And I think it's kind of a shame. And for this park to really feel immersive and like it could be a real park, I definitely should have some realistic interiors in certain areas. Plus, it also helps to make the park feel alive if you can walk around in it and actually visit the buildings and have some signs of life outside the buildings, like signs to restaurants and entrances to restaurants or toilets or whatever. It just makes the whole park feel better from the outside as well. So yeah, we're doing interiors, and this building specifically is going to house a small restaurant. Now, I should use the word restaurant kind of loosely, because when I want to build big restaurants, I think it's better to put them on the outskirts of the park as well, or at least at a place where you can hide most of the restaurant building. In this case, it's in the middle of a themed area, and it's kind of helping to provide all of these facades with a lively indoor section. So this is just going to be a simple takeout restaurant where you can get fries and stuff like that. Honestly, if Planet Coaster had kebab, this would definitely be where I sold kebab. Unfortunately, that's not quite in the game as far as I'm aware, so, you know, I can request things, but I don't think they're gonna be added into the game at this point anymore. But, you know, a man can dream. Let's just pretend that there are amazing doner kebabs somewhere in this building. And man, I should shut up about that, because I really could go for one now. Anyway, I built a tower just now that also didn't quite work out the way I was trying to make it work out. It just felt way too small. So I ended up building another tower here, and this tower is a little bit interesting as well, because it kind of looks like it's on a full tile, but it's a little bit smaller. So everything on this building has to be built kind of separately and piece by piece, and it's a little bit of a hassle, but I think it's worth it for, once again, the overall composition of this area. It manages to give it some forced perspective as well, because it looks like a full-sized building, but it's a lot smaller than it seems, and especially in this game where everything seems like a full tile when it's just a little bit less than a full tile, it really helps to sell the forced perspective, I think, or at least that was the idea with this building. Now, this little tower doesn't really have a function other than the fact that this is the corner, so this is where I want some of my most detailed and interesting architecture to be. And then between this and the other corners, there's mostly going to be some filler architecture, some small separate facades with some roofs and windows and doors and decorations here and there, but nothing too involving, like this tower here with its custom arches and detailed roofline and everything that it has. Now, to come back to the discussion about not using your buildings and saving them somewhere on the park file and then using them at some later stage, this is also going to be another example, because you might remember that in the first episode I built this minaret-like tower with a red spire, and I ended up throwing that thing away because I really couldn't come up with a way to make that thing look good. It just looked kind of out of place where I originally built it. So I threw it somewhere in the park file, hoping to hold on to it. You can actually see it in the background just a few seconds ago while I was moving to the other place in the park to try and copy that Oriel window. But yeah, so I had that thing built and it really didn't work out where it was. And then at some point, I wanted to figure out what kind of dome or spire to build on top of this corner building here, because I didn't want to keep the roof completely flat because it just kind of looked like something was missing. And then at some point I decided to sink that tower from episode 1 into the roof of this building and just slap it on top of this, and it just worked out perfectly. Like, it was so good that I don't know, it was kind of hard to believe just how perfectly it worked. So all that just to say that whenever you build a building, no matter how proud you are of it, if it doesn't really work in its area and you're looking at it like, I'm not entirely sure, just throw that thing away. Well, don't throw it away, but throw it somewhere else. Hold on to it and remember that you've still got that unused building. And whenever you're in another area of your park, or in the same area but trying to build a different row of facades and you're stuck, just slap that thing in there and see if it works out. And sometimes that results in the best solutions. So yeah. With that said, I'm gonna move lots of buildings around in this whole area because I have an idea of what the area is going to look like, but not exactly what the details are going to be in which place. So that's the last lesson for today. I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.